A warm welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I'm Layo Olarinde. Here's what's coming up on the program this week. Hungary blocks 50 billion euros in EU aid for Ukraine hours after an agreement was reached on starting membership talks in Brussels. All the EU leaders say aid negotiations to resume early next year. And strikes continue to intensify on southern Gaza with intense bombardment on towns and cities including Khan Yunis and Rafah by Israeli forces. Plus, a conversation with Mr. Collins Nweke, foreign policy commentator, on the situation with Ukraine. Diplomatic Channel begins right now with a quick check on other discussions in diplomatic circles.
China's President Xi Jinping was on a two-day visit to Vietnam in a bid to strengthen his ties with the Southeast Asian nation and counter U.S. influence. The Chinese president was welcomed by the chief of Vietnam's ruling Communist Party at the presidential palace in the capital, Hanoi. Two sides signed 36 agreements and pacts agreeing to conduct joint patrols in the Tonkin Gulf. It's President Xi's first trip this year to an Asian nation. The communist-ruled neighbors are close to economic areas but at odds over the South China Sea. The pacts mark an achievement for Vietnam's diplomacy, although analysts and diplomats said the improvement in relations could be more symbolic than real. The United States says it's been coordinating with Beijing to arrange military-to-military talks.
We have been working closely with our defense attaché office, and our policy team's been in active coordination with Beijing in order to arrange communication.
However, Major General Ryder says there are no announcements on any talks at this point in time. Britain, Japan and Italy's defense ministers have signed an international treaty to establish a program aimed at developing an advanced fighter jet. The parliaments of each country must ratify the agreement, which aims to see the combat aircraft in flight by 2035. The joint development phase of the program will begin in 2025. Both the joint government headquarters of the Global Combat Air Program and its industry counterpart will be based in Britain. The government organization's first chief executive will come from Japan, while the first leader of the business organization will be from Italy, according to the announcement.
The risks and problems from Europe to the Indo-Pacific are clear for all to see. And so it is enormously important that we join together across our nations to produce this kind of security for our skies.
The supersonic stealth jet will feature a radar that can provide 10,000 times more data than current systems.
The ground incursion into Gaza's second city, Khan Yunis, has intensified as Israel pounds the area. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel will continue its war effort until absolute victory is gotten.
Israel stepped up its bombardment of Gaza overnight and into Sunday, with Palestinians saying dozens of people were killed. It comes after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu argued the only way to secure the release of hostages was intense military pressure on Hamas.
חיסול החמאס, שחרור כל חטופינו, והבטחה שעזה לא תהפוך מחדש למוקד טרור.
Residents and militants say Israeli attacks took place amid fierce fighting on the length of the coastal enclave. Communications were also down for a fourth day, making it hard to reach the wounded. Hamas militants say they will not discuss freeing any more of those captured when they attacked southern Israel on October the 7th. If Israel continues the war on Gaza, it unleashed in response. With no signs of compromise, violence has intensified. In Khan Yunis, injured Palestinians were rushed in ambulances and on donkey carts to Nasser Hospital after what they say was an Israeli airstrike on the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency school. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, the frustrated families of hostages held in Gaza set up a campsite near Israel's defense ministry. They vow to stay there until the government secures a deal with Hamas to release their loved ones.
It's important for me to be here today because we need to put more pressure on the government to remind them that the hostage situation must be ended with a deal, and the deal must be right now because we don't have any more time to waste. We cannot wait for them to try to rescue them by army with army forces. It needs to be with diplomatic deal, by a negotiation.
We just want them to sit, all the cabinet will sit, and we'll find a way to negotiate and to bring our people home. We want them home, but no one is doing nothing right now except fighting. And fighting is not the answer right now. We want our people here, back home, with us. And if we fight, we cannot bring them alive. And we don't want to get bags. We want to get them alive.
Around 19,000 Palestinians have been killed, according to Gaza health officials, and thousands buried in the rubble of Israeli airstrikes since October the 7th. Israel says Hamas militants killed 1,200 people and captured 240 hostages in their surprise raid that day.
India's Supreme Court has upheld the government's decision to revoke special status for the state of Jammu and Kashmir, ordering the region to hold elections by September 2024. Now, this is much to the disappointment and rejection from Pakistan's caretaker government.
Retained an element of sovereignty or internal...
India's Supreme Court has upheld the 2019 decision by the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to revoke special status for the state of Jammu and Kashmir and set a deadline of September the 30th next year for local polls to be held.
We have held that Article 370 is a temporary provision on a reading of the historical context in which it was included.
The unanimous order by a panel of 5 judges declared special status as a temporary constitutional provision that could be revoked. It ordered that Jammu and Kashmir should return to being a state at the earliest opportunity.
We direct that steps shall be taken by the Election Commission of India to conduct elections to the Legislative Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir, constituted under Section 14 of the Reorganization Act by 30 September 2024. Restoration of statehood shall take place at the earliest and as soon as possible.
Posting on X, formerly Twitter, Prime Minister Modi called the judgment a beacon of hope, a promise of a brighter future. Members of Bajrang Dal, the Hindu nationalist group, celebrated and welcomed the court's decision. However, Pakistan's caretaker government rejected India's Supreme Court decision and says they will write to the United Nations.
Pakistan categorically rejects the judgment announced by the Supreme Court of India on the status of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu and Kashmir is an internationally recognized dispute which remains on the agenda of the United Nations Security Council for over 7 decades. The final disposition of Jammu and Kashmir is to be made in accordance with the relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions and in accordance with the aspirations of the Kashmiri people. India has no right to make unilateral decisions on the status of this disputed territory against the will of the Kashmiri people and Pakistan. We will certainly write to the United Nations Secretary General, OIC Secretary General, the European Union Parliament, basically apprising them of the futility and this decision, illegality, we will point out the illegalities and the contradictions that are there in this decision.
Political parties that oppose the revocation, as well as two former chief ministers of Jammu and Kashmir states, say they were disappointed by the verdict. India's only Muslim majority region, Jammu and Kashmir, have been at the heart of more than 75 years of animosity with neighboring Pakistan since the birth of the two nations in 1947 at independence from colonial rule by Britain.
Hungary is against the 50 billion euros European Union aid for Ukraine, coming after the bloc agreed to formally open membership talks with Kyiv. The leaders say they would revisit the issue next month after Hungarian Prime Minister refused to back the additional funding for Ukraine's government, even as it battles Russia.
Leaders of the European Union and Western Balkan countries posed for a family photo as a summit gathering them in Brussels to discuss the bloc's enlargement and Ukraine's membership bid is underway. The two-day summit is an occasion for the leaders to reaffirm the Western Balkans' destiny within the European Union, as well as the bloc's potential expansion to include Georgia, Moldova, and Western Balkan nations such as Montenegro. Meanwhile, North Macedonia, Albania, Kosovo, Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, and Herzegovina are all candidates or potential candidates to joining the bloc.
If you look at the Western Balkan economies, they stand today at around 35% of the EU average. In other words, there's a lot of untapped potential. And this is what the new growth plan is looking at. There was a lot of praise for the new growth plan.
We want to work with those leaders to make sure that we have more alignment. We face extraordinary difficult geopolitical challenges with the war launched by Russia against Ukraine. And that's why it is so important to speak with one voice, to act in the same direction, and to do everything to protect our common values, to protect our interest.
Croatia was the last country to become a new member of the EU in 2013, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine has put enlargement back at the top of the EU agenda. Speaking of the Ukraine crisis, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban says Ukraine did not fulfill the criteria to start accession talks with the EU, standing firmly against the view of other EU leaders. Mr. Orban is blocking both the start of EU membership talks and 50 billion euros in financial aid for Kyiv.
The first is that to get is better late than never. Second, why we are here is not to make business. It's not about bargain. It's not about deal. We represent approaches and principles. So to give money to Ukraine is easy to do because in short term the money for Ukraine is already in the budget. So there is no any extra decision to give it in short term. In long term and the bigger sum of money, my position is that we should give it outside. But we are not under the pressure of the time because the bridging solution is already in the budget. Enlargement is not a theoretical issue. Enlargement is a merit-based, legally detailed process, which has preconditions. We have set up 7 preconditions, and even by the evaluation of the Commission, 3 out of the 7 is not fulfilled. So there is no reason to negotiate membership of Ukraine now, even not to negotiate.
And for Montenegro's president, Jakov Milatovic, he's hopeful Hungary will change its attitude towards Ukraine's bid to join the EU.
I'm very much hopeful that Hungary will also change its attitude towards the European perspective, not so much for the Western Balkans, because, as you know, Hungary is very much supportive of the Western Balkan European perspective, but also when it comes to the Eastern neighborhood. I think that the choice of the Ukrainian people is very important, and you all know that Ukrainian people want to be the part of the EU.
Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar is of the opinion that without ongoing support for Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin will win.
This is probably one of the most important ones that I've attended, precisely because of the big decisions we have to make in relation to Ukraine. A financial decision and also a decision on whether to begin negotiations. And we have to say yes to at least one of those two, and ideally both of those two, because Ukraine is in peril. Ukraine will not stand without support and ongoing support from both the European Union and the US, the two towers of freedom and democracy in the world. And if Ukraine doesn't have support from the EU and the US, well, then Putin will win.
The European Commission recommended last month that EU leaders agree now to start accession talks with Ukraine, but all decisions related to future accession require unanimity amongst the EU's 27 member countries.
Joining us now is Mr. Colin Sunweke, a foreign policy commentator. He joins us from Brussels, Belgium. Thank you so much for joining us on Diplomatic Channel.
A pleasure to be with you, Layo. Thank you for having me.
What do you make of the European Union's opening membership talks with Ukraine and Moldova? I mean, what benefits would you say this has for Ukraine?
The decision by the European Union to admit Ukraine as an accession country is a strategic win for Ukraine, but also means a lot for the EU, because over the last period of times, you have heard EU leaders assert and reassert the fact that Ukraine belongs in Europe in terms of their culture, their evolving or evolved democracy, their free market economic structure, respect of rule of law, and the rest of them. All of those put together, that Ukraine is one of them, and they should waste no further time, bringing them in. And so, the decision during this ongoing summit to admit them as an accession country is indeed a strategic one. But let's not make any mistake about this, Layo, because it is still a very, very long path to walk. In the sense that there are a number of hurdles in terms of the negotiations that have to now commence. This is actually ringing the opening bell to start the actual discussion. Give and take, we're looking at about 10 years before Ukraine can actually become a full member of the EU and then begin to reap the benefit. Now, if you also take into consideration the ongoing war there and the aggression from Russia, then you get a clearer picture of what this means for Ukraine as a very positive thing, but also for the EU in terms of bringing Ukraine closer home to EU.
Now, in bringing Ukraine closer to the EU, President Zelensky has hit quite the roadblock in seeking funds from the EU and US. We know from the EU, Hungary has just blocked 50 billion euros, and the president, Prime Minister Orban, has said it's a bad decision to open membership talks for Ukraine. Why is Hungary so opposed to this?
It is a bit difficult to put a finger on the actual genuine reason that Orban, the Prime Minister of Ukraine, is actually stalling, as a matter of fact, actually constituting a curb on the will of Ukraine joining, Ukraine joining the EU. Now, there are different factors to look at. Number one is the fact that that is who he is. He is a far-right politician who sees most things politically dark. That's on ideological level. On the other hand, you also hear talks about his close alliance with Moscow, that he's an ally of Putin. And so what he's doing there is actually acting as a mole within the EU against not just Ukraine, but against things that the EU fundamentally stand for, and by doing so, helping his ally, Russia. But there is also another facet of it, and that is the fact that in the last, years, Orban hasn't been having it that easy with the EU. There have been questions about, the rule of law and democracy in, Hungary. Take, for instance, gay rights, how extreme he has been on that, and the fact that, different laws are passed that are, short of being undemocratic. And so they have actually, the EU has actually blocked a fund that is supposed to go to Hungary on the basis of these complaints that they have about the country. So on the other side, one could actually surmise or suspect that one of the reasons that Orban is doing what he's doing now by stalling the talk is to actually twist the arms of the EU to let go of the funds that they have tied down, actually strengthening his own negotiating power. So the reason he's doing what he's doing cannot be one. I think it's a number of factors all tied together.
We know Ukraine is still seeking anyway to join NATO, but has not yet achieved that objective. And you say Russia doesn't want NATO anywhere near its borders. So do you think Ukraine will ever get this NATO membership? And we must remember Finland and Sweden also, they have gotten much headway in entering the alliance.
Yeah, I think on the scale of priorities for Ukraine at this moment, joining the NATO is somewhere in the lower rank of the ladder. I think the most important thing for them now is joining the EU. Now, ultimately, that might happen, but even in the run-up to the war, to the invasion, they had actually stepped down that ambition. But the thing is that not enough was done to reassure Russia that Ukraine joining the NATO is indeed a strategic and urgent objective, a priority for that matter. So they didn't rule that out, and they didn't really rule it in. But the reason was essentially that it is not up to Russia to determine for NATO how they should run their affairs. So joining them ultimately in 30, 40, 50 years, perhaps, but this is not an immediate priority. Their immediate priority now is, number one, defending themselves, and then joining the EU.
All right, Mr. Nweke, just finally, I mean, with the war in Gaza and also in Ukraine and countries picking sides with their allies, where would you say the world is headed now in terms of order?
Well, obviously, at the end of all of these, the new world order is probably going to emerge because now this war is between Russia and Ukraine. One could say that the US and the EU are fighting the war with Ukraine by proxy. Now, they are not the only ones fighting this proxy war. You can also, see the non-aligned stance of China, even though, there are signs that they lean more towards Russia. Then you can also, think about the new alliance that the bigger countries are also forming to actually constitute, some sort of competitive tool against America's dominance. So at the end, the world order as we know it today may be redrawn as a consequence of, all of these wars, taking place.
All right, then, always a pleasure, Mr. Collins Nweke, foreign policy commentator. Thank you so much for joining us on Diplomatic Channel.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Lara, for having me.
This is where we end the program this week. I'm Layo Olarinde. Thank you so much for watching.